So we continue with Federalist 30, Part 4. How can it ever possess either energy or stability, dignity or credit, confidence at home or respectability abroad? How can its administration be anything else than a succession of expedient, temporizing, impotent, disgraceful? How will it be able to avoid a frequent sacrifice of its engagements to immediate necessity? How can it undertake or execute any liberal or enlarged plans of public good? So, without a good source of revenue for the government, your government is going to be impotent, disgraceful, temporizing. In other words, it'll always have a temporary answer to huge problems. So Hamilton is telling the anti-federalists that we need to be able to tax not only the imports, but to tax individual American citizens of different states when emergency arises. Because under the Articles of Confederation, you could not tax individual Americans. You had to ask the state to give you money. And the state might tax them. But Hamilton's saying that's a crazy way of doing that, because we just don't know when emergencies will arise. Let us attend to what would be the effects of this situation in the very first war in which we should happen to be engaged. We will presume, for argument's sake, that the revenue arising from the import duties answers the purposes of provision for the public debt and of a peace establishment for the Union. Okay, let me read this again. Let us attend to what would be the effects of this situation in the very first war in which we should happen to be engaged. We will presume, for argument's sake, that the revenue arising from the impost duties answers the purposes of the provision for the public debt and of a peace establishment for the Union. Thus circumstanced, a war breaks out. What would be the probable conduct of the government in such an emergency? Taught by experience that proper dependence could not be balanced on the success of requisitions, unable by its own authority to lay hold of fresh resources, and urged by considerations of national danger, would it not be driven to the expedient of diverting the funds already appropriated from their proper objects to the defense of the state? It is not easy to see how a step of this kind could be avoided. And if it should be taken, it is evident that it would prove the destruction of public credit at the very moment that it was becoming essential to the public safety. In other words, let's say we make enough money from the impost taxes, from the taxes on imports, and we don't need to tax individuals. If a war breaks out and we need more money, okay, how are we going to get this money? We're going to need additional money, and he says what we might do is, instead of paying off our debt, we'll tell our debtors, sorry, we can't pay your debt this month and the next month while the war is going on. So he says we lose our credit this way, and that's the worst thing you can do. So why put yourself in that situation? To imagine that at such a crisis credit might be dispensed with would be the extreme of infatuation. In the modern system of war, nations the most wealthy are obliged to have recourse to large loans. It says these days, even big, powerful nations, when they engage in war, they have to be able to get some money, borrow some money from other places. A country so little opulent as ours must feel this necessity in a much stronger degree. He says we are not strong yet. We are not that rich yet. So we probably, in a time of war, we need to definitely be able to borrow money. But who would lend to a government that prefaced its overtures for borrowing by an act which demonstrated that no reliance could be placed on the steadiness of its measures for paying? The loans it might be able to procure would be as limited in their extent as burdensome in their conditions. They would be made upon the same principles that usurers commonly lend to bankrupt and fraudulent debtors, which, with a sparing hand and an enormous premium. So if our credit is bad, then when we go to borrow money, they will do to us what usurers do. Usurers are those people that let you borrow money at a very high interest rate. Okay? So in other words, you will just be broke by the time you pay off your debt. So he says if we have bad credit and war comes up, war happens, and we go to borrow money and they will ask us for so much interest that the whole government will be shut down because we won't have any money for anything. It may perhaps be imagined that from the scantiness of the resources of the country, the necessity of diverting the established funds in the case of supposed would exist. Though the national government should possess an unrestrained power of taxation, but two considerations will serve to quiet all apprehensions on this head. One is that we are sure the resources of the community, in their full extent, will be brought into activity for the benefit of the Union. The other is that whatever deficiencies there may be can without difficulty be supplied by loans. The power of creating new funds upon new objects of taxation by its own authority would enable the national government to borrow as far as its necessities might require. Foreigners as well as the citizens of America could then reasonably repose confidence in its engagements. But to depend upon a government that must itself depend upon 13 other governments for the means of fulfilling its contracts, when once its situation is clearly understood, would require a degree of credulity not often to be met with in the pecuniary transactions of mankind, and little reconcilable with the usual sharp-sightedness of avarice. Reflections of this kind may have trifling weight with men who hope to see realized in America the halcyon scenes of the poetic or fabulous age. But to those who believe we are likely to experience a common portion of vicissitudes and calamities, which have fallen to the lot of other nations, they must appear entitled to serious attention. Such men must behold the actual situation of their country with painful solicitude and deprecate the evils which ambition or revenge might, with too much facility, inflict upon us. So this last paragraph says, for people who are a little wise and have read history, have reflected on history of the ages, they know that if we just do wishful thinking and think that the state governments will be helpful to the national government when emergency happens, they're dreaming, and they're a dreaming bad dream. Experience has shown us that this will not happen. We just went through a revolutionary war, and we saw what happened when we asked the states for money. And we don't want to do the same thing. So this is a lot about revenue, taxation, and I have already told you about that book, Unruly Americans, and there are other books that talk about the situation of debtors, creditors, public credit in the United States then. When you get to a point that you want to learn more, those books are available and you can learn a lot from them.